There's a moment that happens to almost every man near the end of his life. A moment when the noise finally fades. The applause disappears. The cameras stop flashing. The phone stops ringing quite as often. And somewhere inside the silence, the memories begin to speak louder than fame ever did. For Al Pacino, that moment came at 86. Not on a movie set. Not during an award ceremony. Not in front of a cheering audience. But quietly, reflecting on a life that the world spent decades watching, while almost nobody truly understood the man living inside it. Because for all the success, all the iconic performances, all the immortality Hollywood gave him, there was one thing Pacino never seemed able to hold on to for very long: love. And according to those closest to him, there was one woman who stayed in his heart longer than anyone else. One woman he never fully got over. One woman he would later describe, in deeply personal reflections, as the true love of his life. But to understand why that confession matters so much, you first have to understand the loneliness hiding behind the legend. Long before the fame, before the Godfather, before the Oscars and standing ovations, Al Pacino was just a quiet boy from the Bronx trying to survive a world that already felt unstable. He was born into struggle. His parents separated when he was very young, and much of his childhood was shaped by emotional absence. Raised largely by his mother and grandparents in a cramped apartment, Pacino grew up surrounded by financial hardship, uncertainty, and tension that never fully left him emotionally. Even as a child, there was something inward about him. He observed more than he spoke. Friends later described him as intense, sensitive, almost haunted long before Hollywood ever touched him. Acting became less of a dream, and more of an escape. The stage gave him something real life never consistently offered: connection, identity, control. But even then, the loneliness stayed. In New York during the 1960s, Pacino struggled for years. He slept on couches, worked odd jobs, sometimes had almost no money. Yet people who knew him back then said he carried a strange emotional depth, like someone searching for meaning instead of success. And maybe that's why audiences connected with him so powerfully later. Because when Pacino played broken men, wounded men, dangerous men hiding pain beneath silence, he wasn't really acting all that much. Then came 1972. The Godfather changed everything. Almost overnight, Al Pacino transformed from a struggling theater actor into one of the most recognizable faces on earth. But fame did something strange to him. Instead of opening him emotionally, it made him retreat even further. Hollywood wanted the mysterious Pacino, the intense Pacino, the untouchable genius. And slowly, the line between the public image and the real man began to disappear. He became addicted to work. Film after film. Performance after performance. Entire years consumed by characters. Relationships entered his life and quietly fell apart. There were romances with actresses, artists, intellectuals. Women drawn to his brilliance, his sensitivity, his unpredictability. But many relationships followed the same painful pattern. Pacino would get close, then emotionally disappear. Not because he didn't feel deeply, but because deep feeling terrified him. Friends and former partners often hinted at the same truth. Al Pacino could express devastating emotion on screen, but in real life, vulnerability frightened him. Commitment frightened him. The possibility of losing someone frightened him. And sometimes, people who fear loss the most become experts at emotional distance. Over the years, his personal life became increasingly fragmented. Relationships ended quietly, some painfully, some mysteriously. He became a father later in life, but even fatherhood existed alongside long stretches of emotional isolation. The strange thing was, the more legendary he became, the lonelier he seemed. By the 1980s and 1990s, Pacino was no longer simply an actor. He was mythology, but mythology is a terrible place to live as a human being. People saw the icon. Very few saw the exhausted man underneath. And somewhere during those decades of fame, success, and emotional drifting, one relationship began affecting him differently than all the others. It wasn't just passion. It wasn't just attraction. This woman seemed to reach a part of Pacino that almost nobody else could. Around her, the emotional armor softened. The guardedness cracked. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, Pacino appeared genuinely vulnerable, not as an actor performing emotion, but as a man terrified of how much someone meant to him. People close to him noticed it. The way he spoke differently around her. The way his intensity became calmer. The way he seemed, briefly, less alone. But love arriving late in the life of a deeply wounded man rarely comes without complications. Because by then, Pacino's fame was enormous. His habits were deeply ingrained. His fears had spent decades hardening into emotional walls. And sometimes, when someone finally reaches your heart after years of isolation, the experience can feel less like comfort and more like danger, especially for a man who spent most of his life running from intimacy while desperately craving it at the same time. What made this woman different from every other relationship in his life wasn't just how deeply he loved her. It was what she forced him to confront about himself. And in the end, that may have been exactly what destroyed them. By the time Al Pacino reached middle age, love had already become one of the most complicated parts of his life. Not because he didn't feel deeply, but because deep emotional connection always seemed to collide with something inside him that feared permanence. For years, people closest to Pacino described the same contradiction. On screen, he could portray vulnerability with terrifying honesty. His performances felt emotionally naked. But in real life, intimacy often overwhelmed him. The closer relationships became, the more he seemed to retreat inward. And yet, there were two women who reached him in ways few others ever did. The first was Diane Keaton. Their connection began during the Godfather years, when both were still becoming legends without fully realizing it. Keaton saw Pacino before fame completely transformed him, before the pressure, the isolation, and the emotional exhaustion that would follow him for decades. She later described him as brilliant, shy, emotionally mysterious. And she loved him deeply. The relationship between them carried a kind of unfinished sadness that lingered for years. Keaton wanted emotional certainty, stability, a real future together. Pacino loved her, but love alone could never overpower his fear of commitment and emotional vulnerability. Their story became one of Hollywood's great what-if romances. Even long after they separated, there remained tenderness between them, a quiet emotional respect, the sense that both understood how meaningful the relationship had truly been. But if Diane Keaton represented the great lost love of Pacino's younger years, then Beverly D'Angelo became something even more emotionally significant later in life. Because Beverly entered his world during a very different chapter. By then, Pacino was no longer the uncertain rising actor from the 1970s. He was already a legend. The fame was permanent. The emotional walls were older, heavier, more difficult to break through. And yet somehow, Beverly D'Angelo reached him anyway. Their relationship began in the 1990s and slowly became one of the deepest personal bonds of his adult life. Unlike many of Pacino's earlier romances, this relationship unfolded during a stage of life when the realities of aging, loneliness, and emotional legacy had started becoming impossible to ignore. For perhaps the first time, Pacino seemed to experience something resembling domestic life. Not Hollywood fantasy. Real life. Conversations at home. Shared routines. Emotional dependence. Vulnerability away from cameras. And eventually, children. The birth of their twins changed Pacino profoundly. Friends and observers noticed it immediately. Fatherhood softened something inside him. The famously guarded actor suddenly appeared emotionally exposed in ways the public had rarely seen before. Beverly witnessed that transformation firsthand. That's what made her role in his life different from almost everyone else. She didn't simply know the icon. She knew the aging man underneath the icon. The exhausted man. The frightened man. The emotionally conflicted man trying to balance love, fatherhood, fame, and decades of unresolved emotional habits. And for a while, it seemed possible that Pacino had finally found the emotional stability he spent years running from. But some patterns become deeply rooted after a lifetime. Pacino still disappeared into work, still struggled with emotional consistency, still carried fears he could never fully explain. The relationship between him and Beverly became intense, loving, but also deeply strained over time. There were emotional conflicts, misunderstandings, periods of distance. The pressures of fame never truly disappear, especially when one person has spent decades belonging partly to the public. Yet unlike many of Pacino's earlier relationships, this one carried enormous emotional consequences because children were involved. Suddenly, love wasn't only about romance anymore. It was about family, responsibility, time, and perhaps that frightened Pacino even more than intimacy itself. As years passed, the relationship slowly unraveled. Publicly, there were legal disputes and painful headlines surrounding custody and financial disagreements. But underneath the media attention was something sadder and more human. Two people who once genuinely loved each other struggling beneath the weight of emotional damage neither fully knew how to repair. And for Pacino, the heartbreak seemed to cut deeper because Beverly represented something he rarely allowed himself to fully experience. A real emotional home. Not just passion, not just chemistry, but the possibility of lasting connection. That's why, when people close to Pacino speak about the emotional turning points of his life, Beverly D'Angelo's name continues to carry unusual weight. Because she wasn't simply part of his story. She became part of the life he secretly wanted, but perhaps never fully knew how to hold on to. And by the time he realized how precious that life truly was, parts of it were already slipping quietly away. Now, at 86 years old, Al Pacino exists in a place very few people ever reach. Not just old age. Reflection. The kind that arrives after decades of noise finally begin fading into silence. The film sets are quieter now. The frenzy of Hollywood feels farther away. Entire generations grew up watching him as an untouchable cinematic giant, but age has a way of removing the distance between legend and humanity. And in Pacino's later years, there's been something unmistakably different about him. More honest, more vulnerable, less interested in protecting the myth. Because eventually, a man stops measuring his life by awards and begins measuring it by memory. And memory can be merciless. For Pacino, those memories seem to lead repeatedly back to love, especially the women who shaped him emotionally in ways fame never could. Diane Keaton remains part of that emotional history. She represented the youthful version of Pacino's life, the years before emotional exhaustion fully settled into him. Their relationship became one of those eternal Hollywood stories built around timing, longing, and unfinished emotion. But Beverly D'Angelo occupies a different emotional space entirely. She became tied to the part of Pacino's life where the illusion of endless time began disappearing. With Beverly, the stakes became real in a way they never fully had before. Not just romance, family, children, a shared private life behind decades of public identity. That's why many people believe she ultimately became the deepest emotional relationship of his later years. Perhaps even the true love he quietly measures the rest of his life against now. Because Beverly saw him during the years when the armor had already begun cracking. She witnessed his fears about aging, his loneliness, his emotional contradictions, his struggle to balance freedom with closeness. And perhaps most painfully, she witnessed how difficult it remained for him to fully surrender emotionally, even when he desperately wanted connection. That's the tragedy running through Pacino's life story. He spent decades portraying men consumed by love, loyalty, and family, while privately struggling to hold on to those same things himself. Now, in old age, those contradictions seem heavier than ever. Because fame changes meaning over time. When you're young, fame feels powerful. When you're old, it can feel strangely empty. The applause fades quickly in quiet rooms. Awards don't sit beside you at night. Movie history cannot replace emotional closeness. And perhaps Pacino understands that now more deeply than ever before. In interviews, there's often a reflective sadness in him. Not dramatic despair, but the expression of someone who has lived long enough to recognize what truly mattered after spending years distracted by everything else. That's what makes the emotional weight of Beverly D'Angelo's chapters so significant. She represented a version of life Pacino may secretly have wanted all along. A real home, real intimacy, real emotional permanence. Not the mythology of Hollywood love, but something quieter and more difficult. Something real. And maybe that's why his reflections feel so haunting now at 86. Because deep down, he seems to understand a painful truth that arrives for many people too late. Success can give you admiration from millions, while still leaving you alone with the memory of the person who mattered most. In the end, Al Pacino achieved almost everything a human being can achieve professionally. Immortality in cinema, respect across generations, A legacy that will outlive him by decades. But when the cameras disappear and the performances end, what remains are not scenes from movies. What remains are faces, voices, memories of people you loved imperfectly. And somewhere inside those memories, there appears to be one woman whose presence still lingers more heavily than the rest. Not because the relationship was flawless, but because she came closest to giving him the emotional life he spent decades searching for beneath all the fame. And now, at 86, looking backward through time, that realization may carry more emotional weight than any role he ever played.